All right, how's everyone doing this morning?
Good.
It's good to be back with you all. Last week, my children were getting over the flu, so they're now better. For a little while. I'm sure those of you with kids who have ever put them in daycare or have grandkids that are in daycare, you know this is a big wake-up call for as a first-time parent. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and you also notice that my PowerPoint presentation does produce the closed caption here. So I have nothing to do with that. The computer does it by itself. And wherever I've presented with this newer computer, I've had people saying, wow, that's really nice. I mean, at Gethsemane, where I'm a member, Gethsemane Lutheran Church, I have folks who appreciate this feature. How are we feeling about Paul the Apostle today?
Oh, pretty good.
Have you thought about him at all over the past week? Oh, yeah. I have found, I used to be somewhat averse to reading Paul and preaching about Paul, and after doing more study, a lot of the things that I'm discussing in these lectures, I'm more interested to go back and read these letters, knowing that, well, there's a real human being that was problematic in all kinds of different ways, and he lived in a complicated world in which his religious and ethnic identity was secondary and was viewed as just kind of allowed to exist by a larger empire. And this guy's trying to figure out how to live and survive in this complicated world. And we're reading some of the writings that were preserved by him. So I'm more, based on where I'm at in my studies, I'm more likely to appreciate what I find in Paul. Even when I read things that I'm like, no, that's not it, or which I'm sure we all encounter these things in our scriptures. So we'll continue today talking about Paul the traveler and the writer. And I assume most of you all were probably here last week, but for those who weren't, and also I discovered that the audio didn't record on last week's video, so just very briefly, what we discussed last week were all of the different views on the Apostle Paul. And you kind of have the long-standing, traditional Lutheran view of Paul. Lutheran because Martin Luther absolutely loved the writings of Paul and actually regarded them as more authoritative than even the Gospels. And this is the view that Paul was thoroughly anti-Jewish in his approach to interpreting the Hebrew Scriptures and the Jewish law, and that he characterized it, and all of the theologians after him have characterized Judaism as using works to get into, I don't even want to say get into heaven, using works to be justified before God. And of course, Martin Luther would say, absolutely not, right? I am completely against a works-based righteousness. This is a grace-based righteousness. It's a free gift. And that's not bad, but it's just predicated on the assumption that you are right as a Christian and that the Jewish people are wrong. Or that, did I use the word last week, supersessionism, that Christianity has somehow replaced Judaism, or that, let's put it in the language of people, that Christians have replaced Jews as God's chosen people. You can read Paul, you can read Romans, and he doesn't argue anything like that. And to us moderns, it almost seems like, how did we get here? But we got here, and that has been the long-standing view of Paul. There was a new perspective of Paul that developed in the late 70s, And it was trying to get away from this anti-Jewish supersessionist kind of theology. And the argument was, Paul wasn't against Judaism writ large. Paul was just against a very narrow, ethnocentric kind of Judaism in which Jews themselves said, well, you have to be exactly like us to be God's people. So this new perspective says that, no, observance of Jewish law is not necessary for salvation if you're a Gentile, right? It's not that the path to salvation is invalid for Jewish people, but that if you're a Gentile, there's a different path to salvation for you. So that was the emphasis of this new perspective, right? 1970s. Late 80s, 90s, you get even another perspective. Well, Paul actually abandoned his Jewishness, and he broke with Judaism entirely. So, the emphasis was upon this transformation, this kind of conversion experience of Paul. And I personally had not encountered that in any, I didn't grow up Lutheran, but the Lutheran view was the main view of Paul in the sermons I heard growing up in the Church of God. I had not encountered this apocalyptic perspective, but it's out there, and it's another way of understanding Paul. That also feeds into an anti-Jewish theology. All right, we're up to 3 views, right? The most recent thing within the last 2 decades has been to situate Paul within Judaism, and to understand that Judaism itself is not just a monolithic, singular entity, but that the period in which Paul is doing his work is a period in which there are many competing views on how to be a good Jew, how to be a faithful Jew, how to interpret the law. And there's even evidence of this in later rabbinic literature, and I can't remember if I mentioned this last week, but when you read the writings of the early rabbis, you read things like Rabbi Ben Zakkai argued this point, then it lays it out. Then it goes, then Rabbi Gamaliel, he argued such and such. And then Rabbi Akiva, he argued such and such. And then the discussion just ends. The rabbis don't say who was right. They just present all of the views. And there's an argument or a dialogue there, and that's it. Now, contrast that with the earliest Christian writings that we have from the early church fathers, and think about all the church councils that we've ever had where we have to establish who is wrong, right? Name who is wrong, and say, we're right. The council, whatever that is, the people who hold the power are the ones who rule what is right. We don't want to overlay that, we're used to that. Here's orthodoxy, here's heterodoxy. We don't want to overlay that onto our understanding of Judaism in the first century, because Judaism just allows all of the different perspectives to stand, and you kind of choose, well, I'm team Pharisees, or, well, you can't be team Sadducees unless you were born a priest, so, but you could choose to be, I'm going to go join the Essene movement out in the desert, and you can do that. Or you feel that you need to take matters into your own hand and do something about Roman imperialism, so you join the Sicarii, the dagger men. That's what that translates to. So many different ways of being Jewish, and Paul is just one guy within this milieu, within this complicated structure. I don't even want to say structure. I don't know what to say. Just this context of competing Judaisms, plural. And he's one guy, as Matthew Thiessen writes, Paul is one ancient Jew living and thinking and acting within a diverse Jewish world that sought to be faithful to Israel's God and Israel's law. Now, what's distinctive about Paul's Judaism is that he's trying to open up a path. He sees himself as the herald to the apostle to the Gentiles. That is unique about Paul and his and the Judaism that he espouses. And of course, what's the defining feature of his Judaism? Jesus is the Messiah, right? Yeah, we won't go, I'm not going to go on a tangent on how many messiahs there were, how many self-proclaimed messiahs popped up during this time. But Paul believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and that the implications of his messiahhood, of Jesus' messiahship, was that it wasn't just Jews who could be a part of Abraham's family. It was now a broader enterprise that included Gentiles. Today we're going to be diving into, I'm not going to say this is the fifth view on Paul, but the current scholarship spends a lot more time trying to understand Paul as a historical figure. Not just what he believed, but how he acted in the ancient world as a cosmopolitan Jewish citizen, or Roman citizen who also happened to be Jewish. Okay, so we all know Paul through his letters, right? And we kind of brush that aside. Okay, Paul wrote letters. Letters were very significant in the ancient world. The purpose of letter writing in the Greco-Roman world was to enhance or maintain personal contact where you couldn't physically be in touch with someone. And according to, I'll say, how would you pronounce this name? Cicero, right? Now, if we were really reading Latin, we would say Cicero, because there's no soft C sound in Latin. That's okay. Cicero, and he gave this collection of speeches that he gave. He remarks that the purpose of letters is to make the absent one present for conversation. And you get that sense in Paul when he's writing, and sometimes, even Corinthians is the example that comes to mind. He seems to reference past letters, and there seems to be an ongoing argument. And our 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are just like a snapshot of his rebuttal to something or his initiation of an argument. But these letters are an ongoing conversation. They're an ongoing dialogue that Paul had with churches. Now, the letters typically follow a standard format. You have an epistolary prescript. You always start out so-and-so to so-and-so. Chairein, hello. That's Greek for hello. And then you have, and Paul, he's creative with this, okay? He weaves in his own theology and, grace and peace to you. Okay, he personalizes this. This would be like when you go into Word and they provide templates for you to make a resume or something. You pull this up, and Paul's like, okay, that's nice, but I'm gonna expand on this and do my own thing. You have an epistolary health wish or prayer, right? Paul includes these things all the time. Whether it's in the opening or the closing of the letter, Paul usually has good wishes, blessings from God to you, that sort of thing. You have the body. You have some greetings, and this is important when we study Paul. Sometimes we skip over these things. This will be an important point next week in next week's lecture. But Paul references all of these co-workers, his co-ministers. Send my greetings to so-and-so, or so-and-so over here, they send their greetings to you. He references all these people, and we skip over that because we're like, oh, there's no theological significance in this name. No, this is Paul's network. He works with people who have chosen to come on board with his, they joined his organization. Let's say that. Okay, they're on the payroll. And they're doing the same work. He'll oftentimes give travel plans. Sometimes this isn't explicit. Sometimes it's at the beginning. Sometimes it's at the end. But he'll say, I've been to such and such a place, or he'll just mention where he's at in the moment, why he's absent physically from their presence. And then, of course, the farewell, the closing. So Paul is participating here. It's not just that we have snippets of Paul's thought or his theology in these letters. It's that we get a glimpse into how he established and maintained relationships with all of these communities of believers, how he valued and how he cherished the connections that he had. Paul as a traveler. So this is, if we go to the the letter of Philippians, the letter to the Philippians, Paul makes some geographic references in this letter. And typically, what do we do when we hear these geographic references? Just go past, whatever. We don't think about what the mechanics, the logistics behind these things. So Paul, when he's writing to the Philippians, he mentions that he had traveled to, this is the letter to the Thessalonians. He had traveled from Philippi to Thessalonica. Thessalonica is how we're going to say it today. So here, my laser doesn't work on the screen, so sorry about that. Philippi up there, down to Thessaloniki, and that is a journey of 97 miles. That would be taken by foot. And it would take roughly, at least 7 days. At least 7 days, walking from when you wake up to when you go to bed. And along that way, you've got to take care of your food. You've got to take care of your lodging. You have to not get beaten up or have all of your things stolen from you on the road. This is, when you read ancient travel literature, this is like the dominant theme. Like, traveling is dangerous. There are thieves waiting on the road all the time to get whatever they can. So this is a dangerous trip, and usually, does Paul have a place to sleep every night? I don't know. But anyways, 7-day trip to Thessaloniki, and then he says that he's writing the letter to the Thessalonians from Athens down here. So he's referencing, I came to you from Philippi, I was in Thessaloniki for a little while, now I traveled down. Whether he did this on foot or by sea, this is still a much longer trip, by boat, a little bit shorter, but he's now in Athens. And so just the amount of travel, and that's 186 miles, 186 miles from Thessaloniki. And so when he's writing here, okay, so he's traveling along like this, he's writing here, and he makes this reference that the message to the Thessalonians, okay, the message he delivered to the Thessalonians has reached Macedonia, okay, so he's referencing the region, and Achaia, and every place. And he talks about this as like the message that he preached in Thessalonica, he's hearing it from other people in these other places. So the Thessalonians have already spread the message that they heard to various people. And just to think about the kind of network that Paul had established, whether it was people who were all Jesus followers, or whether he just had, a merchant in Thessalonica was, part of this network of delivering news, a doctor in Athens, or some random philosopher he met on the street who he thought was an interesting character, But to think about how this message spreads and how Paul, comes to hear, wow, I preached that to the Thessalonians. How in the world do you know about it already, right? It's already being spread. And this is just one instance of Paul as a traveler. We know that Paul traveled widely in the Mediterranean world, going as far as, where's the farthest west that he traveled? Rome, right? He gets to Rome. Of course, yes, yeah. So he travels widely, and just to appreciate when he mentions those sorts of things, what went into his travel, the risks that it implied, and also the support system that he had to have had as he establishes relationships and connections with all of these different communities.
Do we believe that Paul is talking to people who can read and write?
Let's see, first century. Okay, this is hard to pin down, but the estimate on literacy in this period, and I can speak for Judea, because a lot of the literature from that period, that's what I read. But the literacy in Judea in the first century was about 3%, like overall. It might have been up to 15% in an urban setting. And what I would guess is that in the communities that Paul establishes, that there might be one or two people who are able to read his letters out loud. Remember, in a society where, let's just say, 3 to 15% of the people can read, let's just say that. The majority of people need to hear the written word out loud. So it's important to understand, and also, I'm trying to think, at this time, reading silently to yourself wasn't even a thing you did. No one read a letter silently to themselves. You read out loud to an audience. That was the purpose. The written word was there to be expounded or performed even before people. And so, yeah, not everyone could read. They would be.
My point.
Okay.
My point is that he is looking to have that letter performed.
Yes.
Everything about it is stylistic and is from the way royalty speaks to royalty at that time.
Yeah, I hear
Very
you.
diplomatic.
Yes. Yeah, I am not versed at all in Greek and Roman administrative writings, but I would agree that if Paul follows a standard epistolary format, it's probably similar. Probably, in the ancient Near East, the administrative tablets that we have, they're very short and succinct. And I would imagine the Romans for the most part are pretty much like, get down to business in their writing.
He did this in Hebrew or Latin or Greek?
Paul operates in Greek. All of these letters, these are in Greek. But if we believe Paul, as he writes at the end of Philippians, that he's a Hebrew born of Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin, as to the law, a Pharisee, it's probably safe to assume he probably read Hebrew. I mean, if he had that sort of training and background, he probably read Hebrew, or at least, possibly. He operated in Greek, though. Again, he's operating in the Greek world. His ministry is not in Judea and Jerusalem. That's Peter. Peter was, what is it? Peter was the minister to the circumcision faction. That's what Paul says. Okay. Paul is the herald or the apostle to the uncircumcision faction in the wider world. And of course, they argue about this.
So with the Roman control of that area, why wasn't kind of the language, the widespread language, Latin?
The question is, if the Romans were in charge, why wasn't the overall language Latin? Because Latin hadn't become the standard language for the empire yet. This was still at a time, the Romans were fairly savvy in that they recognized that they didn't really have any culture. And so they appreciated the culture of the Greeks, and they allowed that culture to remain at the fore. The Romans were a driving military force, and they were, in the early days, good administrators. And they operated primarily in Greek. It's not until like the 2nd and 3rd centuries that we start to get Latin as kind of the lingua franca of the empire. So, any other questions about Paul the Traveler? This is a fascinating part of Paul's studies right now. How did he recruit people to his side? You know, we think about, well, he was an evangelist. What does that even, we're thinking in modern terms what an evangelist does. I don't know, stand on a street corner. Yeah, I'm a Lutheran, I'm bad at evangelism. So, but how did Paul actually recruit people to his brand of Judaism, following Jesus? So in the book of Thessalonians, we get a window into this. They declare, that is Paul and his companions, they declare the gospel in a transparent and sincere manner. So when they're there, they're not trying to just carpetbag and come in and stay for a night, take a collection, and then leave. They're sincere in the gospel that they preach, and they engage with the people that they're staying with. So I mentioned last week that instead of translating the Greek word ekklesia as church, we should understand an ekklesia as an association of people who look out for each other, right? This is not a world where the Romans are providing health care or disability insurance or anything like that. If you want to be taken care of, you have to belong to a group of people who are willing to take care of you and who you are also willing to take care of in return. Somewhat like, well, I don't want to get too political, but I mean, we could think about these things as trade unions. You have people in a similar trade or job or line of work, and they join together to care for each other's families. Paul comes in and it says that they worked, and the Greek word there is ergazomai. Instead of thinking about that work as like, oh, Paul worked by spreading the gospel. No, like Paul came in and worked next to these people. He joined their association. He did the labor. He labored and toiled. Again, the Greek words are common among trade associations of this time. He labored and toiled so as not to burden any of you. In a time where freelance religious experts would come in and they would give their message, whatever they wanted to teach, and then they'd say, okay, I gave you this knowledge, now give me some money. Okay? At this time, Paul doesn't do this. Paul comes in, he works his way. He pays his way, he does the work, he builds the relationships, he doesn't want to be a burden to the people he's talking to. And so we can imagine that this is not just like a weekend stay. Maybe not even a week. Maybe not even a month. This might be a drawn-out period that Paul is a part of this group. And he establishes a rapport, and then this association is refounded as an association of Jesus followers. And if you imagine that sort of process lies behind all of these letters. He did this in Corinth. He did this, Ephesians is, he did this in Corinth. He did this in Galatia, Thessaloniki, right? This is how Philippi, this is how he operates. All right, thoughts on this?
He's the ultimate salesman for God.
He's a good salesman. Although, that term has kind of a negative connotation sometimes today.
Just in terms of understanding this more historically, maybe you said this last week, how widespread were the Gospels at that point? Was there one particular Gospel that was more widespread than another? Was he carrying Gospels with him? How do they fit
This is a great question. So the question is, what was the Gospel? Were there any Gospels that were widespread at this time? What was Paul operating with? And are you talking specifically like Matthew, Mark, Luke,
Yeah,
or John. Yeah. So the Gospels are written after Paul dies. So Paul, right, our New Testament, the people who put our New Testament together, put the Gospels first. But if you put it on a timeline, the Gospels are late. Paul's letters are our earliest Christian, we'll say Christian, earliest writings on followers of Jesus. And Paul, I would argue, now let me think here. 1 Corinthians 15. Okay. One of my New Testament professors had always said, okay, in 1 Corinthians 15, you can find Paul's elevator gospel, his elevator speech, kind of his like shorthand version of the gospel. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, he starts out this way. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in return had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then the 12. So Peter, then the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. That's the shorthand, that's the gospel for Paul. The gospel is that Christ died for our sins, that he died, that he was raised, and then he appeared to certain individuals, and it just continued to spread. Paul doesn't talk about Jesus' birth. He doesn't talk about no details of Jesus' ministry. This is the gospel. This is it. There's this guy, Jesus. He died, and he rose again. And that's the gospel. So it's an interesting question to think about. By the time Paul dies, around 60, it's not until he dies that you start to get these more elaborate gospels, like Mark. Mark isn't even elaborate, but Mark, Matthew, Luke for sure. And do you think those are the only 4 gospels out there? No, there's a bunch of other gospels that we have evidence of as well. Those are just the ones that they allowed to go in your New Testament. Okay.
I noticed you were a little hesitant on Ephesians.
Ephesians, yeah, you're right. I was hesitant on that. And in my mind, I had a debate. Okay, it's possible that Paul went to Ephesus and that he ministered there. I'll grant that. The letter to the Ephesians has come under doubt as to whether it's an authentic Pauline letter. And in my opinion, and Colossians goes with that. Ephesians and Colossians kind of go together. I'm a language person. So when I see the statistics of a linguistic analysis of Ephesians, in which there are tons of words used that Paul never uses in any of the other authentic letters, we're talking like words that carry more theological significance of a later sort. It's hard for me to imagine that Paul adopted a totally different kind of rhetoric and a whole new set of vocabulary when writing just 2 letters, but then maintained consistency throughout the earliest letters, Thessalonians, Titus, Philemon, and through to Romans. So, do I think that means we should get rid of Ephesians? No, I don't think that. It's just that I have to be honest about Paul probably didn't write this. But someone who really liked Paul and who was influenced by his teaching wrote in his name, which, guess what? Totally common practice at this time. Totally acceptable. Nothing wrong with it. So, yeah, thank you for asking about Ephesians.
Isn't that what Paul is looking for? Is it that kind?
Would Paul be okay if someone wrote in his name? Does he talk about this at all?
If he's spreading the gospel,
No, Paul's pretty particular about his own message, and when people diverge from that, I think even, I'll mention Galatians here in a second. Galatians is one of the more, one of the letters where we get some of Paul's kind of frustrated emotion. You know, you've allowed people who speak another kind of gospel to come in here, like you're abandoning what I taught you. And so I feel like he probably has a pretty strong sense of ownership over his version because he believes that that was revealed to him, right? He's very passionate about that. So I don't know if Paul would have been okay with people writing in his name, but
Delusion is not what he's looking for.
I think it's really hard to know, but part of this, what we're seeing is that plagiarism is such a modern concept.
yes.
What we think of as plagiarism, even 50, 60 years ago, some of the great theologians that you and I have read, someone like Karl Barth, footnotes, no one. Do you think that that means all of his words are original? Of course they weren't. So even 50, 60 years ago, plagiarism is wildly different now from what it was then, much less 2,000 years ago. So it's really hard to know. The explanation for how, and I agree with you, I think Ephesians and Colossians probably are not written by Paul. But the argument for how it could be is that Paul did not write these letters himself. He had secretaries.
Yeah.
And what it was, I forget the word, animasis or something.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we know that if you have a secretary writing for you, there is probably a well-accepted gap between what Paul is saying and what the person is writing that would have been considered acceptable. How big is that gap allowed? We don't know. So is it possible that in Ephesians and Colossians he has a secretary who's simply using more editorial freedom than others? Yeah, it's possible.
Which is an acceptable and documented scribal practice. I mean,
Is it likely? Who knows?
we have evidence that if you were a child of wealthy Greek parents and you were fortunate enough to go to school and learn rhetoric, part of your training was to be able to replicate the writings of the greats, Homer, Cicero, Thucydides, and not only just to, you would start out just by copying what they did, but then it was, okay, now your assignment is to write as if you are that person. You need to understand their rhetoric, how they used the Greek language, the various turns of phrases that are unique to them, and then you need to create. This is like the original AI. Okay? Although probably much better than AI today. But yeah, so there's nothing, intellectual property, plagiarism, not a concern. But it's an interesting thing to think about. I have had students, when we talk about the Old Testament and the creation stories, and we talk about how there are other creation stories in the ancient Near East, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis narrative, all of these things, and they're like, wow, these stories were stolen. Like this is, and I'm like, so who did the stealing? When did it happen? And did you know that like this tale was also stolen from a former civilization? Like this is how culture was produced. You borrowed a story and you made it your own, and that's how we have interesting stories from the ancient world.
Well, AI is a real issue for universities coming up.
Oh, I know. Since I've started teaching, I'm in my 3rd year of that now, I've not had one semester where I haven't had an AI paper turned in for something. And it's really hard to, especially since schools don't have official policies on like how to handle this. It's like a case-by-case basis. It's really, it's
Yeah, they
difficult.
do have policies on plagiarism.
Yes, on plagiarism, yes.
Well, but that's pulling stuff out and saying it's yourself.
Yeah, you and I agree on this.
Well, I've been talking.
Yeah. You and I agree on this, but 80% of students do not agree on that.
Well, they have also this chat thing.
ChatGPT.
Thank you. I'm glad I've retired.
This isn't a discussion on AI. We could spend a lot of time on that, but we're not going to. There's another way of looking at Paul, a thing that we overlook all the time. And I would imagine that there's some misogyny that lies behind this. When we think about human emotion, which gender or sex have we typically ascribed emotionalism to? Women. So a lot of times we haven't paid attention to the affective landscape, the affective language that Paul uses in his letters. And this is the focus on language that communicates emotion and things related to moods, feelings, and attitudes. Now, admittedly, that's hard to do when you're analyzing the written word. But if real people are writing these things, they're feeling things and they're in a good mood or bad mood. And I would argue that when Paul sets out and starts writing Galatians, that he's probably not in a good mood. Galatians starts out. Come on now, it's one of those little ones. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Then he just goes on with this theme.
It's got fruits of the Spirit.
What?
It's got fruits of the Spirit.
Fruits of the Spirit? Oh, yeah. Yeah, in terms of, yeah. No, that's exactly it. Yeah. So when we look at, and I return to the Thessalonian correspondence is kind of ground zero for a lot of these new areas of study. There you get this language of longing over and over in 1 Thessalonians. Paul writes, we longed with great eagerness to see your face. We wanted to come to you. There's this strong attachment that Paul has to these people. He wants to be there with them. Not every pastor might say that about their people. At least maybe sometimes. He says that longing becomes unbearable so that they send Timothy, right? Paul couldn't be there himself, so he sent Timothy to check in on them, to make sure they're doing okay. And we long to see you, that sort of thing. So we look at how Paul and his companions express their desire to visit and be with the Thessalonians again. And you get a lot of the, Paul is a person of his time. He uses the language of what would typically be used for a Roman family metaphor. And so he talks about brothers and sisters. Now, we say brothers and sisters, our translations. Paul would have just said brothers, but the understanding is broader than just the male members of a group. He says brothers and sisters 17 times in 1 Thessalonians. He uses distinctly feminine imagery, like gentle, like being like a nurse, viewing himself as a nurse tenderly caring for her own children. He uses traditional paternal imagery. I deal with each of you as a father with his children. He abounds in love for the Thessalonians, and in their care for them, regards them as their glory and their joy. That is Paul's glory and Paul's joy. So there's this language in 1 Thessalonians. When you go to 2 Thessalonians, which is a letter that has come under scrutiny as to whether it's authentic, it's much more formal, less intimate in tone. There's no references to longing. There's only 6 occurrences of brothers and sisters in that letter, and there's no familial metaphors. And I would add that there's a lot of difference in theology as well. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul talks about the day of the Lord. When does it come? Like a thief in the night. You get to 2 Thessalonians, the day of the Lord will not come until or unless such and such things start to happen. Okay? The lawless one is going to come and wreak havoc upon the earth before the day of the Lord. So just big differences there between those letters. We're running short of time, so I will finish with, we just discussed that. Paul, I would argue, also uses the language of empire to subvert the empire. Here is an inscription from the historian Velleius Paterculus, who's writing a history of Rome. And he's writing here about Emperor Tiberius. He says, "The rejoicing of that day, the concourse of the citizens, their vows as they stretched their hands almost to the very heavens, and the hopes which they entertained for the perpetual security and the eternal existence of the Roman Empire. On that day, there sprang up once more in parents the assurance of safety for their children, in husbands for the sanctity of marriage, in owners for the safety of their property, and in all men the assurance of safety, order, peace, and tranquility." Sounds like a great empire, right? Through military might, Emperor Tiberius is bringing peace and security. Now, yes, that's the reference to where this comes from. Now, 1 Thessalonians. "Now concerning the times and the seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night. When they say, 'There is peace and security,' then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape. But you, beloved, are not in darkness for that day to surprise you like a thief, for you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness." And this is one of many examples where Paul seems to be drawing on well-known imperial motifs that would resonate with his audience to discuss what's going to happen in the end, right? What we would say eschatology. Rather than peace and security through imperial might and military force like Emperor Tiberius, it's through the peaceful and transformative reign of God, through communities, right, associations that are transformed by the gospel of Jesus Christ. Rather than the coming of the empire in glory, it's Jesus who comes in glory. The good news is not that the emperor is here and has conquered all, but that it's that God has. So we see this in Paul's other letters. We also get some of this in the Gospels. But the way that the New Testament writers use the language of empire against the empire in a subversive way is, something that we all can take note of today. All right. Any questions? Next week, we're going to be talking about circumcision and Paul's comments on women.
Oh joy.
Yeah, oh joy. So these are important discussions to have. Yeah.
He must have been an extraordinarily powerful person.
Charismatic.
Charismatic,
Yeah,
exactly.
Yes.
In order to effect these changes without any sort of user's manual going along with it. That's why I asked that question.
Yeah, he's writing the user's manual as he goes.
So he must have been, just because there's the show on Netflix about Josiah Smith, about the Mormons, that people claim they had a vision and somehow they're able to manifest what happened then to other people and make them believers. That's an extraordinary process. And what he did was absolutely extraordinary in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that when we study Paul as a historical figure, instead of just like what he taught in his theology, I think he becomes a more interesting, textured individual. And that's a good point. He had to have been a charismatic person who could establish rapport with many people. But he could also be abrasive, right? He did turn off a number of his friends, and he has tiffs here and there, rows here and there with people. But overall, yeah, definitely.
Is he the second most important person in Christianity?
Who's the first? Jesus. Yeah. I think a lot of theologians have said that throughout the centuries. I mean, yeah, if it weren't for Paul, to what extent does how does the gospel move throughout the rest of the Mediterranean world? But you could also argue that Emperor Constantine the Great was a pretty important figure in Christianity for Christianity to become the religion of the Roman Empire. What would have happened? What has happened to other religions that didn't have the support of an empire? I mean, we don't hear about them anymore. So, yeah. What's there another comment? No. I don't want to keep you from worship too. I know you have church pretty soon. All right.
Thank you.
Class dismissed. Thank you.